I realize in this portion of the video, I'm going to have to start talking about the YouTube channel The Quartering and its creator Jeremy. And to be quite honest, I find the critique of this channel much more difficult than that of Thought Slime. It's not just that the channel is more normal or more normie in internet speak. Jeremy has more moderate politics. His YouTube channel narrative follows the well-worn contours of the anti-SJW protector of pop culture that was so common post-Gamergate in 2014. To my knowledge, Jeremy doesn't say or do anything very objectionable by my standards on his channel, although I have to confess not watching any of his videos for a very long time. Still, most that I have seen follow a very consistent format. Jeremy starts with bringing up some form of pop culture, some beloved franchise, be it Super Mario, Looney Tunes, The Last of Us, and then recites some kind of litany or grievance, some social justice issue that's being crammed into the newest remake, the newest narrative concerning this franchise. Afterwards, there are complaints about the company politicizing their product, claims that this new political content will ruin the franchise and cause fans to stop buying it, claiming, as the slogan goes, that the companies, once they go woke, will also go broke. This is the narrative of pretty much every quartering video, and I think it's no surprise that Jeremy has really hung his hat on the whole "get woke, go broke" slogan. And before I go on with my criticism, I probably should give Jeremy some credit. This narrative and this format have been wildly successful for him, outstripping his previous career as a YouTube creator that largely focused on Magic the Gathering-centered content. Frankly, I'm amazed he's been able to keep this up so long and maintain interest so long. But apparently there's an audience for it, and quite a large one. And if you want, you can hit subscribe and hear Jeremy post weekly or bi-weekly updates, complaining about how wokeness is ruining the latest video game franchise, the latest superhero movie, the latest board game release, and how it would all be just so great if we could get beyond ideology, move towards a general liberal point of view, and all go back to the way things were in the 90s, when ideology wasn't so front and center. Longtime watchers of this channel will probably be well aware of my critique of these kind of channels and these kind of liberal narratives. To rehash quite briefly, get woke, go broke is a total lie. Sure, these companies might make marginally less money by incorporating purely ideological elements into their product, but 6 years after Gamergate, I think we can lay to rest the claim that this is going to drive them to bankruptcy. And it's quite obvious from the persistence of this ideological bent in most progressive corporations, which is to say most corporations overall, and certainly most entertainment corporations, that these companies get more from their progressive indulgences than they lose in sales. In short, the company can make their product as woke as they like, and they know that most Americans will simply shut up and buy. As for the Chinese market, selective editing and a copious helping of hypocrisy will suffice to transform the product into something that can sell internationally. Quite frankly, when it comes to political channels like The Quartering, who are now 2 to 3 years old, I can't believe how this get woke, go broke narrative continues to maintain itself. After all, The Quartering has plenty of content on a weekly basis, and none of these companies have gone under. They keep on doing this shit, and there doesn't seem to be any punishment for it, or none that they really care about. And as for the pretensions of these post-Gamergate channels to be defenders of some kind of ideologically neutral liberalism, so evidenced in the halcyon days of the 1990s when no one cared about this shit, well, I have news for you. This ideologically neutral liberalism doesn't seem to lead anywhere. It's intellectually and spiritually vacuous, and to the astute observer of history, everyone who's looked at the preceding decades will notice that this ideological vacuum, this pose of neutrality, was the direct predecessor and indeed the creator of the SJW menace that occurred post-2012. Once again, I'm utterly baffled how this non-ideological ideal of liberalism is even appealing to many people. It sounds so soulless and boring. To paraphrase the Big Lebowski, say what you will about the wokies, at least it's an ethos. Don't we want to grasp for something higher? But as it turns out, probably most people really don't. And at least when it comes to YouTube channels, complaining about the SJWs and the wokies ruining video games or Magic the Gathering will suffice. And all of these points I've brought up in previous videos. I've said all of these things before. Nerd culture can be a narcissistic trap. A cultural identity based completely on liberalism is hollow. But this is really not the subject of today's video. Rather, it's something more personal. To be honest, I, like Thought Slime, see myself in Jeremy from the Quartering, and that for some reason is a little disconcerting. Perhaps it's not obvious why. I'm not like Thought Slime. I certainly don't see Jeremy as some kind of pseudo-racist, some crypto-fascist. I, after all, have much more right-wing politics than the Quartering does. But still, there does seem to be something subtly unwholesome in how the Quartering has set up his channel's narrative, his relationship to corporate product that I can't quite put my finger on, and it goes right to the heart of Thought Slime's critique of nostalgia. Despite this channel's professed skepticism towards nerd culture, I will admit to a guilty pleasure of being quite an aficionado of complex board games, in particular complex deck-building card games, which are my personal favorite variety. Indeed, this proclivity goes way back to high school, starting with the game Magic the Gathering. Incidentally, the very game that Jeremy from the Quartering had first dedicated his YouTube channel to covering. Getting in at the ground level of what turned out to later be a very, very expensive game, I enjoyed the competitive aspect of playing all throughout high school, until at the age of 18, interested in other things, I put the game down and never looked back until I sold my collection many years later. Still, my fascination with board games remained, and re-emerged again full force post-college, when, after developing a series of problematic, non-progressive opinions, board games seemed to be the perfect way to keep contact with highly progressive friends without bringing up any contentious issues. This, of course, was the golden age of the board game renaissance. People were discovering games like Carcassonne in Puerto Rico and Betrayal at the House on the Hill, and new interest was developed in very involved and possibly even competitive board games. As per my previous inclination, I was particularly interested in deck-building games, and here once again I came in contact with the most popular competitive deck-building game. In fact, one of the only competitive deck-building games that it seemed everyone played, regardless of where you actually went to play board games. Wizard of the Coast's Magic the Gathering. Now I have to confess having a huge love-hate relationship with this game. I like meeting new people, and I like playing deck-building games, but Magic the Gathering is an entirely flawed game. And it's not actually mechanics, there's no problem with how the game actually works. But in truth, Magic the Gathering is less a classic board game in the conventional sense, and more of a corporate IP product with a game mechanic stapled to it. Here, the problems with Magic the Gathering are obvious. It's mercenary. It's prohibitively expensive to play competitively, and the financial aspect of the game constantly makes casual play a problem and generally unpleasant, even though it's the most ubiquitous card game of its type in any game shop. Often people incorrectly diagnose the source of this problem as being due to the game's natural meta-environment, the constantly shifting pool of cards that players have to construct their decks around. This, however, is completely incorrect. The constantly shifting metagame environment for deck building is part of the fun. Moreover, it has nothing to do with the game's cost, its weird and corporate pay-to-play nature. High-quality mass paper printing has been a thing since the 1870s, and being able to play Magic the Gathering, even at a competitive level, wouldn't have to and shouldn't cost you more than a yearly subscription to some glossy magazine. In fact, the mercenary nature of Magic the Gathering has nothing to do with the game's design or meta. It has everything to do with specific choices made by Wizards of the Coast to intentionally manufacture something that has a high financial cost to it for players. On the surface level, the benefit to the company is fairly obvious. More money to be made selling the product over and over and over again to people who want to maintain collections. But at a deeper level, I felt that there was always something more dirty going on. The company seems fastened on making playing this one board game into an identity, into a lifestyle, rather than a pastime where you meet other people and have a good time. In order to do this, the cards have to have financial worth to them, which is why supply has to be artificially restricted and demand artificially elevated. And hey, I'm not the only one complaining about this. The game's original designer, the inventor of the deck-building game, Richard Garfield, complained about just this problem in Magic the Gathering. Good games shouldn't be mercenary, they shouldn't be pay-to-play, and and they shouldn't be lifestyles. But of course, he and the corporation that owns Magic the Gathering, Wizards of the Coast, saw things differently, and they quickly found somebody else, Mark Rosewater, who was willing to go in a direction they wanted, going full throttle on the Magic the Gathering as a consumer identity, rather than a simple pastime. For this reason, I've always wanted to see Magic the Gathering and Wizards of the Coast fail, and hopefully be supplanted and replaced by something that's healthier. But this, realistically speaking, is very unlikely to be the case, and it's not simply path dependence. Wizards of the Coast goes out of its way to destroy rivals. In short, they play dirty, and it was one of these dirty plays that originally brought me to the YouTube channel The Quartering and its content creator Jeremy. At the time, this being 2018, Wizards of the Coast had just torpedoed one of their rivals, a board game called Android Netrunner that had been developed by Richard Garfield, and which had directly confronted many of the mercenary natures found within Magic the Gathering. Looking for other people who were similarly angry at Wizards of the Coast, I found Jeremy in The Quartering, and was hoping that this might actually come to something. After all, Jeremy did have huge grievances against the corporation, Wizards of the Coast, starting with ideological problems with their move towards wokeness and political correctness back in 2014. By most accounts, Jeremy was subsequently singled out as an example of someone who was a bad actor. Wizards of the Coast banned him from their events and prevented him from successfully running a Magic the Gathering channel, which is usually based on the corporation giving specific content creators sneak peeks of new products. And all of this was for transparently ideological reasons. To me, it seemed obvious what needed to be done. A direct attack upon Wizards of the Coast's intellectual property. Players needed to independently organize. Players needed to prove that they were separate from the ideological and financial agenda of the company. After all, when it really came down to it, the only thing putting money in Wizards of the Coast's pocket was the honor principle on the part of their consumers. The agreement not to print their own cards, to not get together and play the game independently. Jeremy was certainly angry enough, but no proposal like this ever seemed to come up. He would report on the bad practices of Wizards of the Coast, he would wring his hands, sometimes with a melancholy tone. Man, don't you wish things could be the way they were before all this woke stuff happened? And sometimes with a triumphalist tone. Don't Wizards of the Coast understand that if you go woke, you go broke? It's just a matter of time until we win and things go back to normal. But throughout all of the videos produced by The Quartering, there was never any questioning of the fundamental relationship between the consumer, the player, and the corporation itself. The mode was fundamentally passive. The mode was fundamentally reactive. Jeremy was a dissident against Wizards of the Coast to be sure, but he was still being led around on a string by the relationship of the consumer and the corporation. Just like a drug addict that realizes their own situation, he could become angry, or he could wax poetic about his condition, but his condition would never change. And watching Jeremy from The Quartering, I was forced to come to a similar conclusion about myself. Even in wanting to reform this pernicious relationship, even in wanting to make this product better and more wholesome, I was participating in the same relationship with the company. I was forced to dance to their tune. Just as Red Letter Media's meme about the nerd saying, consume product and then get excited for next product, was I not participating in an only marginally different meme? Consume product and then get angry about next product? It's really not all that different. And watching Thought Slime's video about The Quartering, now 2 years later, I felt like I could see just where this went. I mean, certainly Thought Slime's ideological criticisms against The Quartering rang hollow. Thought Slime sees The Quartering complaining about the ideological bent of a cartoon neither of them watches as evidence that The Quartering has a pernicious ideology, as if this shallowness is some evidence that The Quartering wants to harm people with nefarious use of nostalgia. In reality, I'm reasonably sure that if the shoe were on the other foot, if this was Thought Slime seeing right-wing ideology in media, pretty much the same dynamic would be playing out in reverse, with Thought Slime going apoplectic, even if he did not consume or really like the media in question. But still, the raw and unabashed laziness that Thought Slime pointed to in The Quartering's videos turned out to be more powerful than his ideological criticism itself. The pattern of complaining about products over and over and over again until it becomes routine, hoping beyond hope that the companies in question will just let you return to the normal patterns of consuming their product without any ideology or thought. How is this anything to aspire to? And I'm sure at this stage a lot of people are going to be sighing, oh no, this is where the distributist lectures us all about consumerism, about how we shouldn't form identities around entertainment products, but rather should draw on deeper things like religion and culture and high art. But rest assured, dear viewers, this is not the point of my video now. In some sense, we all need to take the memes about consume product, get excited for next product with a grain of salt. Just as the old saying goes, we are what we consume. And to a large degree, it's unsurprising that the narrative of our own lives is formed and shaped by the cultural products that we consume. But how come this whole process feels so wrong in the modern world? How come when we look at characters like Jeremy from The Quartering and Thought Slime, in spite of himself, we see an identity that seems so hollow, that seems so desperate and transparently trite? And, not to put too fine a point on it, I would say that the reason why the identities of these two men, organized around the culture they consume, seems so fake, is that they are both organized around nostalgia. Of course, as I mentioned in the previous part, we have to be careful with this word. It can't just mean any or all contact or affinity with things from the past. But there is a genuine way, there is a very deep way, by which connection and obsession with the past can be spiritually and personally destructive, and not simply in the Buddhist or Stoic sense. If I could be allowed to take a step back for a moment, I think the most remarkable thing about modern-day man, the thing that sets him aside, is his disconnection from a telos, or an organized concept of goodness and beauty outside of himself. As such, as we truly enter modernity in its full force, modern man is forced to look back on his life and give that life meaning, not through an appeal to some transcendent good, but just because it's his to begin with. As such, looking back, modern people are tempted to imbue their past experiences, and in particular their past consumption experiences, with an almost mythical energy. This thing you consumed or did as a child wasn't just fun, it defines you as a person. It, in effect, contains its own meaning and is inherently good, regardless of any objective evaluation of that thing. And here, I would argue, is where we get our genuine modern notion of nostalgia, a pseudo-religious notion of old culture and old consumer products, designed not so much to find some greater truth or greater goodness in the past, but instead to find oneself, to find an identity and meaning that can be applied to oneself in the present, which, at least from my point of view, is a futile endeavor. And I think we can see this very clearly, both in Jeremy from The Quartering and in Thought Slime himself. Why does Jeremy like Magic the Gathering? Why does anyone like Magic the Gathering? I mean, sure, it's a fun game, but are we really using our relationship with this one game to create a future where games are more accessible and more fun to a greater number of people? I would argue that the current presence of the game Magic the Gathering has in fact hurt these efforts. No. The real reason why we're in love with Magic the Gathering, the real reason that Jeremy likes it, the real reason why even I kind of like it, is that it is part of our past. And when we validate this product, this property owned by a heartless corporation only trying to make a buck for itself, we validate ourselves. And the same thing can be seen even in Thought Slime's absolutely horrible taste in movies. Here, VR Troopers and Ghoulies aren't just overrated, they're flat out terrible. And not even terrible in a way that's funny. But given that this is the case, why even build an identity around them? Well, that's simple enough. They're obscure, they're part of Thought Slime's past, and if he's a true blue fanboy of a franchise so obscure and so terrible that no one else likes it, well, that validates him as being original, even if he's not very original or unique in any other capacity of his life. But, once again, I'm psychologizing. I can't really know what's going on in the mind of The Quartering or Thought Slime, but I feel that I recognize this phenomenon in my own generation because I recognize it in myself. Now, ultimately, I'm not so sure how damaging this nostalgic impulse is in isolation. Certainly among the many things I find lacking in myself, this is a more minor defect. After all, what's a few hours playing a stupid game if you've already centered your life around something that's more meaningful? But still, when I think in the larger sense, when I think in the political sense, this problem of nostalgia still bothers me. There's something to the progressive critique that hasn't been dealt with in its entirety. In fact, in these last few weeks, as we've seen continuing vandalism of historic sites, and in particular historic statues, I've thought back to Thought Slime's video about nostalgia, and how it applies to people with conservative temperaments. Certainly the main thrust of Thought Slime's intellectual argument, as is true with the other attempts to psychologize right-wingers, is false. It can't be reasonably applied to any principled right-winger who thinks about his own ideas, any more than it can a left-wing thinker. Still, many contemporary events have not left me wondering if there was not some psychological reaction inside myself that was still moving in a nostalgic way, regardless of the fact that I knew the toppling of these statues was inevitable, despite the fact that I had seen this phenomenon coming a mile down the road. Every time a new monument was destroyed, I felt a sudden grip of sadness, and I wasn't even really sure why. Why was I even upset to see the destruction of statues depicting Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Stonewall Jackson, or Christopher Columbus? America certainly wasn't actively learning from any of these figures. Moreover, at this point, I think it's fair to say that the country that venerated these figures has long since passed away. Certainly, love of liberty and constitutional restraint on government are good things. There are Jeffersonian virtues. But where, may I ask, are these Jeffersonian virtues in a country that's decided to use the Bill of Rights, no less, to essentially mandate the legality of child murder in all 50 states? Where is the virtue of the missionary and the pioneer family in a country that can't even stand up for Christianity or the family itself in the modern world? And I don't think I even need to mention the militaristic virtue of Washington or Lee. That America ceased to exist a very long time ago. In fact, all of these visions of America are currently dead, and if there is one very obvious feature of the right wing in present year, from Keith Woods to Blackpilled to any of the authors that usually write under the label of NRX, it's the slow realization of this reality. The impetus to try to conserve America is really dead. Now, I should say, I completely understand the emotions behind wanting to fight against the forces of destruction. I feel them every time I see a statue come down, even though my intellect knows that this is just a cosmetic confirmation of a reality that's already taken place. The emotion behind it is, to be honest, nostalgic. I mourn these objects because of what I knew they once represented, not really for the good I think they could do in the future. And increasingly, I think all elements of classic conservatism are going to come to a very similar realization, as bleak as that is. And through all of this, I know what right-wingers will be asking themselves. I know the questions that will be on the mind of all those who follow traditionalist virtues and traditionalist religious obligations. If this political project is dead, if this mode of political interaction has truly passed, then what good can be done? What good can be pursued? When the instinct of familiarity no longer suffices in the preservation of that ensures health, both collective and individual, where can someone look for guidance? Now, I'm fully aware that this question does have an answer. Regardless of cultural decline, humanity has not actually lost information. We still have ancient wisdom, and we still have modern wisdom, and it's available to all those who seek it out. Even if the voices of the past cease to be familiar, they do not cease to be true or good or beautiful, and a genuine seeker can find this truth locked away in religious scriptures, in great works of philosophy, and in the testaments of true religious visionaries. And I imagine if you ask anybody who's more religiously or philosophically inclined, they will give you some form of this answer, a long quest towards an improved hermeneutic, deeper study into the fundamental ideas that undergird our civilization and our notion of right and wrong. Of course, the specifics of the recommendation will differ from person to person, but the form will be fundamentally the same: a heroic war against the culture of the day, of that is easy and familiar, and a return to deeper things, a return to deeper traditions, and deeper thought on new matters that emerge from our present environment. And while I certainly think that this approach and this hope is something that is strong and lasting, I do think it is fundamentally incomplete and lacking something important, especially when it's proposed in isolation. Suffice to say that most people, most everyday people, do not interact with their culture, do not interact with their families in a way that is highly intellectual or highly theological. The average person's interaction with culture, healthy or unhealthy, is instinctual. It's immediate, it's visceral, it's not intellectual necessarily. Much to the chagrin of academics and other philosophers, you can't just hand an average person a book of philosophy or the King James Bible and expect them to really make anything of it. People have to be taught how to interact with intellectually challenging culture. Their approach is developed from a whole lifetime of experiences, not training to be a scholar, but rather building up an intuitive understanding of truth, goodness, and beauty from smaller interactions with other people, but also with simpler and more basic cultural elements. In this last video, I spent much time criticizing the inanity of pop culture identities that are formed from the consumption of pretty trivial and meaningless consumer-grade culture. And in these critiques, there is the implication that a deeper identity could be formed if these elements of inanity did not exist, or did not exist in the prominence that they have in our present-day culture. However, this is only half true. Certainly, a deeper understanding of the universe could be brought about by culture that was more challenging, but this is not simply to say that we could substitute intellectual culture for pop culture and be done with the problem. You're not going to solve the problems of an average IQ person by taking away their pop B-movies and then throwing them a copy of the collected works of Schopenhauer or Kant. This, I feel, is a missing piece in a lot of right-wing analysis of modern-day culture. And I found myself that it was very difficult to answer, at least in a way that didn't seem cheap. For a while I struggled with releasing this video until I could come to some kind of conclusion, and some insight was at hand, albeit from perhaps a very predictable source. One night, when putting away a set of my old children's books, I remarked to my wife in passing that the process of picking these books up, stacking them on the shelf, and preparing to, at some point in the future, read them to my own son, was filling me with a notion of nostalgia, and immediately that struck me as wrong. These old children's books from Brown Bear to Yertle the Turtle didn't seem to be nostalgic. It triggered a similar emotion, but it was different. It was somehow stronger, more subtle, and even seemed to have an esoteric spiritual dimension to it, although not a very intellectual one. Indeed, these children's books weren't great works of literature, they weren't holy scripture, and most of them didn't even contain explicit moral lessons. And yet there was something here, a deep culture that transcended the intellectual, the theological, and the esoteric, and I felt at once certain that I might have an answer, a more explicit remedy to the problem seen in nostalgia, and something that I'll try to explore in the last part of this video essay.